Yaakov married Leah, the zivug of Yaakov and Leah separated the component of the Mashiach ben David, and the son that was born that had that aspect, his name was Yehuda. Yehuda was the son that was born that the koyach of the Mashiach ben David went into him. Yaakov married Rachel, and the zivug that they produced was Yosef, which means that Rachel took out from Yaakov, crystallized the koyach of the Mashiach ben Yosef, and that went into the person called Yosef. That's why we call it Mashiach ben Yosef, but it really predates Yosef. So Yosef and Yehuda were fundamentally the beginnings of the personification of these processes. They became the main individuals who would have the strength and would become the nucleus of these processes. And all the Mashiachim from then on would always come from these two. All Shloshim will come from these two. Before that, the Shloshim were not, it was different matter where the Shloshim came from, you see. But from then on, henceforth, either you were Mashiach ben Yosef because your koyach came from Yosef, or you were Mashiach ben David because your koyach came from Yehuda. Now, you may say, so why isn't it called Mashiach ben Yehuda? That's because Yehuda did a chet, and his chet was that he sold Yosef. Since he participated in the mechira of Yosef, he lost that source. In terms of being called that, he actually was still the source. You see, but he lost certain aspects of that, and that went on into David HaMelech. David therefore became the personification or certain the aspects of these things of the Mashiach ben David. Yehuda lost it. That's why it's called the Mashiach ben David and not the Mashiach ben Yehuda. If Yehuda had not sold Yosef, it would have still been called the Mashiach ben Yehuda. So the Torah says, V'hala chadim yadi. Yosef and Yehuda, it says, Eitz Yosef and Eitz Yehuda. The branch of Yosef and the branch of Yehuda are like two branches of the same tree. These are the Two Mashichim. All the Shloshim from henceforth come from those two. Now, why is it that the Mashiach ben David is dependent on physical lineage and the Mashiach ben Yosef it's not? In other words, the ultimate Mashiach ben David must have come from David HaMelech. However, the Mashiach ben Yosef, his koyach, although it starts from Yosef and it went into Ephraim, and that's why sometimes it's called the Mashiach ben Ephraim. The Mashiach ben Yosef is sometimes called the Mashiach ben Ephraim, or Ephraim.
With Yehuda the parents.
Now, that koyach was able to go into all the Shvatim, you see. So that even later on, someone like Moshe Rabbeinu, who was a Levi, was the koyach of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Why? It has to do with the tachlis of the two. And just very briefly, Yosef accomplishes his tachlis through leadership. Through leadership. Meaning that he shows by his example and by things that he teaches Klal Yisrael how to get rid of the Zoyma or the Kilkul and the Bria. Leadership is a quality which can be attached to any man. It has no difference where you come from or who you're born from. If you have the capacities of personality and koyach nefesh of leadership, then you can have that koyach. David, however, performs his job. The Mashiach ben David performs his job through not leadership or anhoga. He's not the manigador. David is the melech through kingship or malchus. Now malchus is different than manig. There's a different concept. Anyone could be a manig if he has the qualities. But not everyone could be a king. Because kingship or malchus is fundamentally dynastic. You see, you have to be born. You see, the one who rules the kingdom is the one who's heir to the throne. There's a concept of an heir. You see, that's why the Mashiach ben David, since the fundamental way that he will bring the tachlis and the bria is malchus, he must come midor achador physically through each generation. You see what I'm saying? Because it's a different concept. And the reason why the Mashiach ben David goes to malchus is very basic. Because fundamentally the Mashiach ben Yosef simply has to prepare the bria and remove the kilkel. You see, once the kilkel is removed, then the bria is clean and is now ready for the next and major step of bringing it to a level of Olam Haba. But in that step already, you see, the clear understanding that the Banisham is the Melech on the world is there. In the time of the Mashiach ben David, we say, the Banisham will then be king. Who establishes this kingship? The Mashiach ben David. That's why he's a melech. He rules the malchus. Just like the Banisham is a melech then, he's also a melech. You see. So the tzura of the Mashiach ben David takes the same tzura as the Gilui of the Rebbeinu Shalom. You see, since the Gilui, or the revelation of understanding of the Rebbeinu Shalom, will be as a melech, his tzura is as a melech. Because he corresponds, he represents that tikkun, you see. But before that happens, the tzura of the Rebbeinu Shalom is not as a melech, because it's all hidden. It's a hester, there's a tremendous hester in the Bria. So nobody sees that the Rebbeinu Shalom is a king, you see. The best they can see, that the Rebbeinu Shalom has aspects of leadership, or that he rules certain things. But the two malchus is invisible. So therefore the Mashiach ben Yosef is constantly attempting to bring out this aspect of Anhoga, which is really Behesta. You find that in the Pasuk. It says there, Ephraim Mo'oiz Roshi in the Tilam. It says, Ephraim Mo'oiz Roshi. Yehuda Mechoikiki. Ephraim is the defense of my head. You see, I'll get into that, what that means later on. That's a very, very important concept. He's the defense of my head. Ephraim, or the Mashiach ben Yosef, which is Ephraim, is the one who will megala the Torah as such, like Moshe Rabbeinu did. But Yehuda, the Mashiach ben David, he brings the Gilui to Mechoikik. The royal Mechoikik is the Shavet Azov, the scepter.
Yeah.
The scepter of Judah. Shevet Yehuda. The scepter is the symbol of Malchus. In other words, the Mashiach ben David functions and through Malchus, and he's Megala the Malchus of the Rebbeinu Shalom. You see, that's why he's the Melech. The Mashiach ben Yosef cannot be a Melech. He can't be a Melech because the Rebbeinu Shalom is not a Melech in those times. Too much Hester. So he can only function as leading the world to its tikkun. But he cannot rule over a fait accompli, or a completed job as a Melech. That only belongs to the time when the Rebbeinu Shalom's Malchus is Nigla. So, Malchus is dynastic. That's why it must come from Doach Hador, from generations. Leadership is not dynastic. Leadership depends on ability. So that's fundamentally, which I believe is the reason why one must come from inheritance from his fathers, and the other one just simply gets it as a spiritual Yerusha. I'd like to go into a very critical concept here, which is the Indian of using Yosef in a different way. The process of Yud and Yosef, as we said, are tikkunim process. And fundamentally, both of them are continuously going on in all history. Now, which one is the more sensitive to Kitrug? In other words, which process of these two is more vulnerable to the taina of the Satan up in the Shemaim saying, Chal Yisrael does not deserve it? Which one? Yosef. Why? Because Yosef is right, because Yehuda is the union of making a person who is healthy into a person who's very strong. But Yosef is in charge of making a person who's sick into a person who's healthy. The union of Refuah is the union of Yosef. When it says, Ani Hashem Moefacha, it's talking about the union of Yosef. You see? I, the Buddha says, I cure through the union of Mashiach ben Yosef. That's my Refuah in the Bria. When you say in Tefillah, in Shemon Esrei, Roifei Choli Amo Yisrael, you think, well, it means to make all the sick people well, right? What it really means, the emphasis are things that the Bonishim is the Roifei Choli Amo Yisrael, because the Bonishim says, I am your Refuah, I have created your Refuah against Chet. You see, that's the Refuah. You know, that the Bonishim is being Roifei Choli Amo Yisrael, Choli HaNefesh. And the Bonishim says, I cure the Choli HaNefesh of Klal Yisrael. You see, that's why it says in Mashalach there, the Rebbeinu says that if you don't do all the Averos, if you keep my Torah, and you keep my Torah in the mitzvahs, then I will not bring on you all the things that I brought on Mitzrayim, all the makas. You see, and why? Ki ani Hashem moifecha. I am your doctor. Now, when I am your doctor, he's not curing Klal Yisrael from what? From the physical illnesses? Because he says to Klal Yisrael, if you don't do chatoyim, you see, then I'm your doctor. What does the doctor have to do with chatoyim? Because the emes refuah is refuah of nefesh, which is the kilkel or the choili that comes in the world because of chatoim. When chatoim come in, they literally make the neshama sick. So you need a doctor. And the Bonishim says, Ani Hashem Rafecha. I am the doctor. Where's my refuah? My refuah is the Eid of Mashiach ben Yosef. That's the tikkun. I split the tikkun, right? Originally, when I first created the world, there was only the Eid of Mashiach ben David. You see, the world didn't have a process which would take care of a person or take care of man if he does a sin. But as soon as Adam did a sin, what happened? The Mashiachim split into a new tikkun. And that tikkun is refuah. You see, that's why there were only two tikkunim in that sense. And that's a tikkun in that sense. Now, since the tikkun of refuah is more vulnerable to the Satan, why? Because the Satan feels like this. I'm going to try and seduce you to do a chet. Okay? Once you do a chet, I got you where I want you. I can now run up to the Baruch and says, aha, you see what he did? He is now in my command. The Yetzer says, I have shlita over him. So if I have shlita, where do you come off curing somebody that's mine? You see, this man did a chet. This man made himself sick because of his own chatoyim. Where do you come off curing such a person? You see what I'm saying? So the kitrug against chet or refuah is the essence of the kitrug. You see what I'm saying? The essence and the process, which is the refuah process, is the process of Mashiach ben Yosef. Hence, we see the following: that in order for the Bonisham to cure the Bria to the Inyan of Mashiach ben Yosef, it's the process of the Mashiach ben Yosef which must remain mostly hidden. That's the process which must remain mostly hidden. So the kitrug doesn't bother. Exactly. That's the one that's always underneath. And that's why nobody knows anything about the Inyan of the Mashiach ben Yosef. That is, I believe, the Inyan of why it's not Megula to the world. Because the Baruch does not want to Megala the Oris of this entire process, how the process works, and so on. Why? It has to go on underneath. When it says, Eich Tzori li Yaakov, Umimeni Yishia, that the Yaakov, Klal Yisrael, is in a tzora, is in a bad place. Umimena, as in the tzora there's Yeshua. What is that talking about? Yosef Yehuda. Yosef. Because the Inyan of Yehuda is the Inyan of Yisurin. And the Inyan of Yisurin is the Inyan of Tzoros. You see. And the Baruch says, the Tzoros will be Moshe Yo. You see. But those Tzoros, why do they have to come in Tzoros? Because it's hidden. You don't see it. When it's in Tzoros, you don't see it. You see. There's another passage that says, Ato Kel Mistaper. You are a hidden God, and a Kei Yisrael Moshiach. The God of Israel who will redeem all mankind. You see. How do you redeem mankind? Ato Kel Mistaper. You are a hidden blood. That's how you redeem mankind. Why? Because of the kitrug. Yosef must always follow into the klippos and always go through a hester. And when the Baruch says in the Torah, Ani Hashem, Ani Asta in front of Yomahu, in those days I will hide my face, the Baruch is saying the refuah will hide its face. The Inyan of Yosef will hide its face. And that will be underneath. That's why there's no gila like that. And that's why it's that Inyan which is most subtle and most concealed from the Bria. Much less so than the Inyan of David. How does the Mashiach ben Yosef do his task when he's hidden? Let's take some of these people. Take Moshe Rabbeinu. Most of the avodah of Moshe Rabbeinu was done where? In Golus. You see. Yeah, Moshe was exiled by Paro, and he had to go to Ethiopia and Golus. For many, many years, for 60 years he was in Golus. That's where he was doing his avodah. That's what it means it's hidden. The Ari. The Ari, for example, was Mashiach ben Yosef. When did the Ari do basically a great deal of avodah? I don't realize the Ari came to Eretz Yisrael only the last years of his life. The last 2 years of his life, he went to Sfat and he was Megala all the great deal of his Chachma. Where was he before that? He was in Egypt. Hidden, alone. If you analyze many of the lives of these people, it means that their avodah, or their greatness, is established when they're unknown, or they're hidden in klippos, means that they are in very tumatic environments. And that's where they establish their greatness. You see. But once they've established their greatness, then they come out, and then they lead the world. But nobody knows that their leadership is an Inyan of Yosef. You see. That's the thing. It's not recognizable. It's not Nika. That's an Inyan of Yosef, as such. Nobody knows that these are... Nobody can point a finger and say, this is the Mashiach ben Yosef in that generation, and this is the Mashiach ben Yosef in this generation. Except in certain extraordinary circumstances. We really don't know. You see. We once can surmise, we can figure out to a certain degree by seeing who was the most profound leader in that generation in really. But sometimes even then we don't know. Because we don't know the nature of that kind of leadership. Just because someone is the most known person in the world doesn't mean he's the one that's doing the most in that world. You see, reputation has nothing to do with performance.
So what is that Indian about?
To show you the extent of the importance of Yosef being in a state of Hester, right? You find an amazing thing. Moshe Rabbeinu, did he know that he was Mashiach ben Yosef? No, he didn't. You see, that shows an interesting thing. He didn't, because when he came to the snare, the Rebbeinu Shem says, I'm appointing you to take Klal Yisrael out. He didn't know that he was going to do that before. He had no idea. This was new to him. And in fact, he didn't want it. He kept on saying to Rebbeinu Shem, leave me out, shlach b'shar tishlach. I don't, he wasn't familiar, he wasn't aware of that thing. That shows an amazing thing, that when it comes the time of the real Geula, when it's about to happen, the Mashiachim themselves don't know about it. And that's the greatest form of Hester. That is the greatest form of Hester. You see? Because of that reason. Because the Mashiach ben Yosef in the earlier times were not as hidden as the one in the later times. Because the longer Klal Yisrael is in the Galus, the bigger the Kitrug. The bigger the Kitrug, the more important it is to hide the process, you see. That's fundamentally what it is. There's a Gemara in Sukkah that clearly alludes to the fact that the Mashiach ben Yosef will die. And fundamentally, this is the only one of the few statements I think in Talmud that refer to Mashiach ben Yosef. There is a lot of other statements that are in the Medrash. I saw in the Yalkut Shimoni on Yeshaya by Nun Beis Nun Gimel is a whole bunch of Midrashim on Mashiach ben Yosef under the name of Ephraim. And we will talk about these Midrashim to understand a great deal what that process is when we go into more detail later on. But fundamentally, from the Gemara, we know that the Mashiach ben Yosef will die. Now, okay, we accept that Gemara, obviously. But the question is, what does it mean? Number one. Number two, why does he die? Now, why is that a question? Because it doesn't make sense. The Mashiach fundamental ben Yosef is a process, you see. And he has as much right to life as the Mashiach ben David. He is needed to mitar the Bria, and the Mashiach ben David is needed to mekadosh the Bria. What does that mean that he dies? You see. So, some people have said and thought, in that sense, that the reason why he dies is because he is an incomplete Mashiach. In other words, he is the first Mashiach to arise, but he lacks the ability to be a Mashiach. He is like an incomplete, immature development of Mashiach. You know what I mean? So therefore, since he is the first messianic attempt of Klal Yisrael, or the first manifestation of Mashiach in Klal Yisrael. But the first manifestation of Mashiach is weak, immature, in the sense of undeveloped, and therefore it dies. You see. Then suddenly comes up the next Mashiach, who is the Mashiach ben David. Now, he is the second one, and therefore he has all the true koiches of the Mashiach already. He is a matured, developed, perfected Mashiach. So therefore, they look at the two processes that the Mashiach ben Yosef is the first half of the process, which is the process which is the beginning of the development, of the birth of the Inyan. But since it's only the beginning of the birth, it falls back into removal, eradication. And then the next part of the process starts, which is the finished part, and that part remains. You see, that's how certain people learn the Inyanim. Now, I've seen that in the Mahalal. The Mahalal learns it like that, which is a very interesting thing. Where did I see it? Netzach Yisrael, I think. I forget where I saw. No, there's a whole sefer that he has. Now, obviously, this view that we're saying here is very different from the view of the Ramchal. You see, the Ramchal's view is very different. The Mashiach ben Yosef is not an incomplete Mashiach, and the Mashiach ben David a complete one. The Torah says, both of these are as one in my hand. That's what the Rebbeinu Shem says. It means that they're both spiritual twins. They both have the same koiches fundamentally, and they have the same right to survive, because they both represent the two fundamental processes of the Kulim and the Bria. Neither one is better than the other, except that Mashiach ben Yosef comes first. Why? Because first you have to be Matar the Bria, and then you can mekadosh the Bria. So therefore, the only difference between the two is that they have a slightly different job, and therefore they have a different sequence in terms of appearance. The Mashiach ben Yosef appears first because his job is first, and then the Mashiach ben David appears after because his job is after. That's all it is. But there is no difference in the status between the two. That's what the Ramchal says, and that clearly seems to be what the thing is. So the question is, why does he therefore die? You see. So what the Ramchal says is the following. The truth of the matter is, Mashiach ben Yosef has no shaykh to death, any more than Mashiach ben David. It's a process. Can't kill a process. Why is it that the Mashiach ben Yosef dies? Because the process undergoes death. How does the process go on death and why? What he says is the following. This is what it means. There will come a time when Klal Yisrael will be Zoicha to the Geula. The Geula Asida. Okay? There will arise in Klal Yisrael the Sherish, who is of the Mashiach ben Yosef. You know? He will then get the Yechida, and he will become the Mashiach. He will take, well, I'll go into this later on, he will take all the Jews out of all the countries of the world and bring them back into Eretz Yisrael.
He'll become Mashiach.
Mashiach ben Yosef. He will be Mekabet Goliath and restore all Jews back to Eretz Yisrael. And the beginning of Yemot Mashiach will start. Suddenly, something will happen. A group of people will suddenly arise and make war with him. You see, what is that war? That's the war of Gog and Magog, which we will go into later on. There was certain Umas Olam who were called Gog, from the land of Magog, and Amalus, who is the head of the Erev Rav, will come together and they will war against the Mashiach ben Yosef after he is already established as the Mashiach ben Yosef. In that war, they will kill the Mashiach ben Yosef. And physically, and therefore by doing that, they will kill the whole beginning of the Messianic process. What does that mean? It means that the Mashiach ben Yosef, in order to become the Mashiach ben Yosef, means that he was successful to remove the Zoyama of the Bria, or to take away the Kilkul. But when Gog and Magog with Amalus come and they kill him, they will bring back the Zoyama and the Bria. That's what it means. The death of the Mashiach ben Yosef means the failure to remove the Zoyama or the Kilkul. It will be attempted, it will be successful up to a point in time, and then suddenly what will happen? He will be killed, so it will go back to where it is. Klal Yisrael will then be thrown into a terrible state of despair. You have to imagine what it is. After waiting so long, the Mashiach ben Yosef comes and they see it and they know it, you know, and they're all in that swirl and they wait. The thing that this is it. Suddenly, bunch of the Goyim get up again. They kill the Mashiach ben Yosef, and they're back where they started from. Now, that kind of disillusion is much more profound than if no Mashiach ben Yosef ever happened. If no Mashiach ben Yosef ever came up, you can always say someday there'll be a Mashiach, okay? But if the Mashiach arrives and then he's killed, you know, there's a terrible loss of hope. You see, that is the Einish, or the Indian of the Mis of Mashiach ben Yosef. Therefore, the process is killed. You see, he is killed because he finally succeeds in the process. And just when it's about to reach full completion, he's killed, so the process reverses. That's what it means, in that kind of sense. And that will bring a tremendous kilkul to the Indian of Klal Yisrael, a terrible despair. I can't begin to describe to you the agony that Klal Yisrael will feel in such an event. You see, but that's what the Gemara says. Such a thing will happen. And that's not the Chevla of Mashiach. That's an incredible unglik. What is this process doima to? The process is doima to, for example, Kriyas Yamsuf, where the Jews leave Mitzrayim and they go out and then they come to the Yamsuf, right? So they're out of Egypt. Suddenly they look up and they look on the foothills there and the Egyptians are back. The Egyptians lie down and they kill Moshe Rabbeinu and they bring back the Jews in the Mitzrayim. That is a comparable situation of the death of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Could you imagine the agony of Klal Yisrael in such a thing? After 10 Makkahs, after everything they went through, with Moshe and everything, all the Nisim, suddenly they wind back up Mitzrayim and Moshe is killed. You see, the agony is profound. Why? Because the agony of the Golus is far longer than the agony of Mitzrayim. Thousands of years in this Golus, and so on. But this is what will happen. And then now, what happens after that? This agony will go on for a long time. I mean, not long, a certain period of time. I don't know how long. It's difficult to say how long this will go on. I get the impression, it's either in question we're dealing with months or several years. But that's all. It's not clear to me exactly the thing. But what happens after that? Something will happen. And suddenly there will arise in Klal Yisrael a new person. And that is the Mashiach ben David. And he will come up into Klal Yisrael and he will identify himself as such, and then he will go over to the Mashiach ben Yosef's body and revive him from the dead. That is the first instance of Tchiyas HaMesim. You see. And then together, the Two Mashichim, the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David, will then war against Gog and Magog and the entire Ummah Olam totally and vanquish them. Where do you see this? V'olu Moshiyim v'Hatziyim Lishpoit es ha'etzav v'hoyusal Hashem ha'melucha. Moshiyim, redeemers, is that singular or plural? Plural. V'olu Moshiyim, the Two Mashichim will arise from Atzion, and they will destroy the last remnant of Esav, and then v'hoyul Hashem ha'melucha, the Moshe Mashiach starts. That is the scenario of what the Gemara in Sukkah is referring to. What I have described to you is the scenario of events of what the Gemara is referring to when it says that the process of Mashiach ben Yosef will come to its fulfillment and then be vanquished. It will then be again vanquished. So that the Mashiach ben David has to come up and finish off the job of the Mashiach ben Yosef and his own job as well. That's the union of the tikkun of the Mashiach ben Yosef to the mitzvah of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Now I want to explain something. The ikazach, when the Mashiach ben Yosef dies and the process dies, is not that the zoyama or the original kilkul will return as such in its fullest. What it means mainly is that the agony of Klal Yisrael will be the main thing, and the Yisurin and the Hest, because of the Hester. You see, they never get, once this Mashiach dies and there's nothing else around, the despair is enormous. It's going to be very hard to be a firm Yid then. People say, we were promised this and that, and look what happened, Gewalt. Even after Mashiach, they killed the Mashiach. And this is not, I'm not talking about some guy that just got up and said, I'm Mashiach. No. We're talking about the Mashiach ben Yosef who gets up with the Yechida on him. Really. And the one who's, what the Ramchal says, Diyukno Noira Mioid. The Ramchal describes the Mashiach and so on. You will not be able to look into his face. The Ramchal says that his Diyukno, or the face, is Noira Mioid. The projection of all from that face is so awesome you will not be able to come out and look into it. So I'm not talking about some kind of guy come lately, you see, who suddenly comes and says, hey, I'm the Mashiach ben Yosef. No. You don't have to ask him the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, you just stand near him and you know he's Mashiach ben Yosef. Because again, the Ramchal also says in a Merdik Zach, is that what will distinguish the Two Mashiachim from all other men and Moshe Rabbeinu after Tchiyas HaMesim is the following, that the Shechina, in every generation, who the Shroshim, there's a nitzitz of the Shechina in those shroshim, and so on. But on the Mashiach who finally happen, when it comes down, right, it says that the Shechina will come down on them as if they were the Beis HaMikdash themselves. Now that is a staggering thing, you see. That means that when you walk near them, it's like you're walking near the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That's an incredible zach. I mean, you can't be staggered that a human being should have that kind of a stature. Where else do you see this? You see it, it says there in the Pasuk. It says there, in the Tanchuma, what does it say? It says there, Yikine Yaskel Avdi, my servant shall become wise. I'll explain these psukim later on. These are the Ikeb psukim. It says about the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David, but the Ikeb Mashiach ben Yosef. It says, Hine Yaskel Avdi, and my servant shall become wise, which means he will be established in his tikkun. And then it says, V'yoram, he will be raised, V'nosa, and he will be lifted, V'govo mi'oid, and he will be carried on high, very high. That's the Lashon. V'yoram v'nosa v'gova mi'oil. That's how big he will become. So the Medrash learns out the following: Hinei Yaskel Avdi. V'yoram, he will be lifted me'Avram Avinu. He will be bigger than Avram. V'nosa mi'Moshe Rabbeinu. He will be bigger than Moshe Rabbeinu. V'gova mi'Malachi Ashores. So that is the individual. He will be bigger than the Malachi Ashores. That is the individual who will then become the Mashiach ben Yosef and be redeemed Klal Yisrael. Could you imagine when that kind of a person dies at the hands of Gog and Magog and Amalek?
He's bigger than Malach HaShor because Hashem comes up from a higher stage.
Yeah.
Higher than
This is the incredible tragedy. Now, why should this happen? Why should such an unglik, such a misfortune occur to Klal Yisrael? Yes. In other words, what we see is the following. Technically speaking, this should not happen, right? Because since the Mashiach ben Yosef is a process, there's nothing in the process itself that says that it must be cancelled or the Mashiach ben Yosef should die. Any more than the prophet Mashiach ben David says it. You see. But yet the Gemara says that it will happen. Why? Obviously, something else must have happened which necessitated this. The question now is, why is it that Mashiach ben Yosef has to die? Now, what we know is an interesting thing. Obviously, if the Mashiach ben Yosef has to die, it points to the fact that there was some Mashiach ben Yosef long before that did some kilkul in that way. But there were two types of kilkulim that the Mashiach ben Yosef can do. And here's the incredible power of the Satan. For example, the first Mashiachim, 2 Mashiachim that were born was Cain and Havel. Cain killed Havel, fundamentally, in that sense. So, fundamentally, when the world is ready for Geula, and the Satan wants to be a Catholic, he is allowed to do one thing else. He is allowed to go to one of the Mashiachim and make him jealous on the other one. You see, in other words, when everything fails, the Satan is allowed to lose the last trick available. It's to get one Mashiach to be jealous of the other. Now, the only one that can be jealous of the other is Yosef. Yosef is going to be jealous of David because David is the Malchus, fundamentally. So, how does he get one Mashiach to be jealous of the other? He gets Mashiach ben Yosef to be jealous of Mashiach ben David through Gaiva. That's what it is. Who are you to be the Melech? I want to be the Melech, and so on. Now, it depends on how close the world is to the Geula. In the Indian of Cain and Havel, and all the other Mashiachim then, whenever the Mashiach ben Yosef failed in some job or whatever happened, or else through the Indian of what he killed the Mashiach Medavin with the Hevel and so on, the world was not that close to the Geula. So it wasn't the Geula that suffered so much, it's simply that the world therefore lost its ability. But in the case of Yosef himself, Yosef was a tzaddik. He was Omed ben Nesoyan in the wife of Potiphar. If he had fallen in that Nesoyan, he would have destroyed his ability to promote the Indian of Yosef. However, Yosef did do certain things that were mistaken. And those things, which we won't go into now, the Indian of the Asor Haruge Malchus and so on, where there had to be certain aspects of the Tikkun of Yosef in order to be established. But Yosef was a tzaddik, clearly. Yosef was tzaddik. Yosef may be tzadkoi. You see, he was the bechir of the brothers. There's no question about that. In that sense, he started the process, and the process went on. It went on until an individual arose in Klal Yisrael named Yerovim ben Nevat. Who was Yerovim ben Nevat? Well, in the time of Shlomo had a son Rehoboam, and in the time of Rehoboam, the Borisham sent Achia Shiloni, who was a very great Navi, who was the Rebbe of Eliyahu Navi, and he sent him to Yerovim ben Nevat and to tell him that he should become the king of Yisrael. That Rehoboam, the Borisham said, I am deciding to split the kingdoms into two, and Rehoboam will become the king of Yehuda, and Yerovim will become the king of Yisrael, of the tribes of Yisrael. That says the Shvatim. And the intention was that Yerovim was supposed to be the Mashiach ben Yosef. This was fundamentally it. Now, Klal Yisrael was very close to the Geula at that point. Very close to the Geula. So close that Yerovim was just about a hair's breadth away from being the Emes Mashiach himself. The reason why we know that Yerovim had the Indian of Mashiach ben Yosef, besides, is that it says in the Gemara, there's learned a number of things, but one of the things it says that Achir met him in the Sodeh. They went out into the Sodeh and they started speaking about many different things. And the Gemara says that we learned from this that Yerovim was speaking to Achir Shiloni about things that were never heard before, Sisra Torah that were never heard. The only one who has that ability, fundamentally, in such a level, is the Mashiach ben Yosef, because fundamentally, in order to do that, he's tapping the Or HaGonas. That's really what it is. He's tapping it. He doesn't have it yet, but he's tapping it up. That's how he's able to know these things in that kind of sense. Yerovim therefore became the Melech of Yisrael, and Rehoboam became the Melech of Yehuda. But there came a certain circumstance when Yerovim became jealous of Rehoboam, because in a certain circumstance, the Beit HaMikdash, he would have had to stand when Rehoboam is seated, because Malchus goes to David. So the entire nation would have had to stand for, I think, Rehoboam, but not for Yerovim. There's a whole mitzvah there. So Yerovim became very jealous of this, and he refused to submit to this kind of thing. So the Bonishim said, the Gaiva. So the Bonishim said to Yerovim, he came to Yerovim and said, look, do tshuva, and you, I, and Ben David, the son of David, will walk in Gan Eden. Means what the Bonishim was basically saying was that if you do tshuva, we will usher in the Yemotze Mashiach. You see, you will be the Mashiach ben Yosef, and Rehoboam will be the Mashiach ben David, and that will be the same. He said Ben Yishai. Yeah. Ben Yishai means that Rechovam, not Ben Yishai. Rechov, not Ben Yishai means doesn't mean David HaMelech. It meant Ben Yishai means Rechovam would have been. So what do you call it? So Yerovam said the famous statement, Mi Barosh, who's first? Mi or Rechovam, not me, the Baruch Shalom. You know, Azach Chutzpah wasn't. Me or what do you call Rechovam? So the Baruch Shalom says Ben Yishai, and he said, if that's the case, forget it. I don't want any part of it. So he went out and he built an Egel, mind you, which is an Indian of Yosef, and he was Choytel Machtas Arabim. He caused all the Yisrael, the Asor Shvatim, to do Avodah Zarah. Now, without going into the details of the matter, what happened here? He was supposed to be Mashiach ben Yosef. Now, the fact that the Banishim said to him, do tshuva, and you, me, and Ben Yishai were walking Gan Eden, showed that he was a hairbreadth away. What does that mean? It means that the Yechidah was already moving to come down. It was in motion coming down. Now, one of the things that it says is that the Mashiach ben Yosef, right before he becomes the Mashiach, right before that time, the neshamas of Yosef and Ephraim come down and the Mesav of his neshama in preparation for the event. He was so close that the neshamas of Yosef and Manasseh and Ephraim had already started coming, they were down already. That's how close he was. And just when he was that close, he decided to be a big shot and go on his own. So, because of that, there was a telpur kilkul that happened. Because by doing the chet, he almost damaged the Yechidah. You see, which means that he would have done a chet if the Chas v'Shalom, if the Mashiach ben Yosef does a chet while he's got the Yechidah on him. That's like that's like the chet of Odom Rishon. That's like forget it. That's it. But he almost had it. So he wasn't Mekalkel that. The Banishim spared that Neshama the Yechidah, but he was Mekalkel the Shirish. You see, the Shirish already, that powerful Shirish had, he was Mekalkel that thing. So what happened? What happened is, as soon as he did the thing, and this is the thing, the Ramchal says is very interesting. He says that the neshama of Yerovam jumped out of his body. It mamash left him, and it went into his son. It went into his son. I forget his son's name. And in the Nachadin it says an interesting thing. It went into his son, and it says there that I think it was Achia. And his son became very sick, and he was dying. And I think it was Achia that came to him and they asked him to daven for his son. And he said, I cannot. Meaning that the Gzera, the Chet of Yerovam has been so great that I cannot save that Shurish anymore. What happened to that Shurish? That Shurish left Klal Yisrael and went into the Goyim. It went into a Goyish person, the Neshama, and it did not return. Many generations later, it returned into an individual who was named Yosef, and he had a son called Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was the shurish of the neshama of Yerovam ben Nevat. That part of it which jumped out with the klippa of that. You see, that's why Rabbi Akiva was the emissary Mashiach ben Yosef in his time, with all of the qualifications. And how did he die in the end? He died in the end to be mechapa. You see, on that achdus and so on.
That's interesting.
Everyone thinks that Rabbi Akiva was Mashiach, that we call Bar Kochba was Mashiach, ben what? Ben Yosef. No, Bar Kochba was Mashiach ben David. Yet, Bar Kochba came from David, the Zerah David. Which means that who was Mashiach ben Yosef in that generation? He was. You see, people think that the Mashiach ben Yosef is the warrior, or the man who fights, and the Mashiach ben David is the scholar. It's the reverse really. The Mashiach ben Yosef is the one who's Megala the Oris of the Torah. Rabbi Akiva, Moshe Rabbeinu, and the ultimate Mashiach also. It's Mashiach ben David who's the one who's the power, who's the Melech. You see, the one who's the Melech through might and rules the world through that thing. The Mashiach Yosef is to kop, to seichel, to das, to or. That's what it says. Ephraim mo'oiz roshi. Ephraim is the defense of my head. The meaning of seichel. That was Rabbi Akiva. However, even though Rabbi Akiva was able to save a part of it, he could not save the Ikar. And the Ikar damage had been done. Which means that Gezerah had to be done. Now, why is it that the death of Mashiach ben Yosef is mechap on that? Very basically. When Yerovam ben Nevat did the chet, what happened? The oris that he should have had from that shurish went into the klippas. That means that the only way he has to get it back. How does a Jew get back klippas from the goyim? When he goes under the shibud of the goyim, or when he's killed by a goy. Remember we said that the Holocaust is nothing more than the Mashiach ben Yosef process. where the Jews, as they were being killed by the Germans, impoverished the Germans by taking back the Or. So therefore, that's true of the Jews. But if the Mashiach ben Yosef himself is responsible for the loss of the Uris of the Mashiach ben Yosef, he has to die at the hands of the Goyim to take it back. That's why, but how does he have to do it? He has to take it back as the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, as the Mashiach ben Yosef, he has to take back those Uris. Because it was, the kilkel was, come out as the Mashiach ben Yosef. So the restoration has to be as Mashiach ben Yosef, in that kind of sense.
That's what Rabbi Akiva didn't do.
So therefore, once he's Mashiach ben Yosef in the end, he has to therefore die at the hands of Almanos or the Goyim. You see, really at the hands of Almanos, which I won't go into, who was the Erev, and so because he's in the Klip of the Erev, because the Eger Azov. So therefore, that's why the Mashiach ben Yosef has to die. He has to die because of the kilkel or the chet of Yerovim ben Nevat, not because he's Mashiach ben Yosef. As Mashiach ben Yosef, he is as legitimate to life as anyone else. You see, because the process is no shaykh to Misa. He has to die because of the chet of Yerovim ben Nevat. And he has to die in that stature of being a Mashiach ben Yosef, you see, and getting killed at the hands of the ones who have the Uris of that Inyan. That's why he cannot bring the Inyan to its full fruition. Why? Because when the Mashiach ben Yosef becomes the Mashiach ben Yosef, in the end, he will have most of the Uris of Klal Yisrael, 99.9%. But there will be 0.1% that he will not have. Why? Because of the kilkel of Yeram ben Nevat. That will be at the hands of the Goyim. So with the 99.9%, he becomes the Mashiach, he's Mekabetz Golis, everything is fine, but he can't complete the job. Because the kilkel has not been removed. And the only way to complete the job is to get that 0.1% of Uris back. Well, who's got that? Gog Moga has that. How's he going to get it back? He dies at their hands. And his death constitutes the last retrieval. His death is not just a brochen of Atollah, just something in vain. His death itself is the tikkun of the Inyan. It's the final tikkun of the Inyan itself. You see, it's a tikkun of Yerovim, and therefore it is a total tikkun of what he calls the Inyan Mashiach ben Yosef. Once that's Mesukkim with his death, then the total Inyan can start with the Mashiach ben David. You see, that's what the Gemara was saying there. That in order for the tikkun of the Mashiach ben Yosef to happen, because of the chet of Yerovim ben Nevat, he must die in the end. He has to take back that last Or. You see, he brings the Inyan of Mashiach ben Yosef to its completion with his death. His death is not a distortion or a deviation of the Inyan. You see, it's not a removal. It's not a failure of the Inyan. His death is the Inyan. Completion. It's a completion. That's the essence of what's going on there. Now, having said all this, before we conclude, I want to say some good news. The good news is that the Mashiach ben Yosef will not die. And this scenario that I just described will never happen. Even though the Gemara says it. Why do I say this? The truth is, from 4 sources, the Ramchal says himself that the kilkel of the Mashiach ben Yosef, that last Or that he would have had to get back with his death, right, is coming back by itself. Why? Because of the Golus, the Arichas HaGolus. One of the reasons why the Golus is so long is to take back that last Or from the Goyim, so that when the thing does start, it can finish with completion, and such a terrible umglik or misfortune does not come on Klal Yisrael. Also, another reason why we'll go back is not only because of the Arichas of the Golus. No, the fact that the Jews have to suffer in Golus at the hands of Goyim so long is to get back all the Uris. You see, because if the Bonachim would have shortened the Golus, then the Mashiach ben Yosef would have had to retrieve the last of the Uris through his death, and that would have been a terrible tzach. So the alternative option is that the Jews should retrieve it, and the Mashiach ben Yosef should stay alive. You see, that's the thing, and that's why the Golus has been so long. Also, another reason why the Mashiach ben Yosef will not die is not only because of the Arichas HaGolus, it's because of the Yisun of Moshe Rabbeinu. Most people don't know, but Moshe Rabbeinu right now, his neshama is in a klippa, is in a very big klippa of the Erev Vav, and his suffering all this time in that klippa brings also the kapor of Klal Yisrael. So the suffering of Moshe and the Arichas HaGolus completes the final inyan, you see, of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Why is it that Moshe Rabbeinu has to suffer? Ultimately, because the thing is that the Yerovim was Mekach of the Indian of the Mashiach ben Yosef, but there was someone else who was Mekach of the Mashiach ben Yosef long before Yerovim. That was the Erev by the Egel Azov. You see, when the Bonishim said Lech Raid, go down, the Bonishim said You have been mekalkel the inyan, not you, but your ummah. But because of that, you have sustained the kilkel in you. And it's your ummah. You brought them in. So therefore, you are the one that will have to bring back that last or which they have brought away. So we have your Ravim's or the lost Oris, and the Erav's lost Oris. And that's the thing. In the end, what should have happened is that the Mashiach ben Yosef in the end should have died to bring back the Oris of Yeravim and die at the hand of Amalus, who is the head of the Eravav, to bring back the last Oris of the Eravav. You see? So therefore, Klal Yisrael itself suffers in the Golus in order to prevent the Mashiach ben Yosef from dying because of Yeravim. You see? And Moshe suffers in order to prevent the Mashiach ben Yosef to die at the hands of Amalus. So they're both of them. Do you see what I'm saying? That's the thing. So therefore there will be a total and final completion. Klal Yisrael, by the kapora of its Golus, is Mesakin the Chet of Yeravim, and Moshe is Mesakin the final Chatoim, the final kilkul of the Erev Lav. You see? And by doing that, there is no necessity for Mashiach ben Yosef dying at the hands of Gog and Magog, and at the hands of Amalus. Now, how else do I know this? The Ramchal says this, number one. I saw this, it's written in the Chal. The Gra said this. The Vilna Gaon brought this down from a Kabbalah, that he said that he received directly from a Malach, that the Gzera on the Mashiach ben Yosef has been listed. Number two, somebody told me that this thing is also written in the Sochachava, that he says that we call the Mashiach ben Yosef will not die in the Mecham of Gog and Magog. You see? If the Indian is Mesukan, according to these sources, in other words, it means that when the Gemara said that the Mashiach ben Yosef will die, it means that according to the process and the Tikkun status, at that point in time, the only way that this could be done is through the death of Mashiach ben Yosef. It doesn't mean what we fundamentally see when the Gemara says that the Mashiach ben Yosef will die. It means that according to the Tikkun process, the Kilkul, because of Yeravim and the Erevav, this is the basic refuah that is needed, the death of Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, but that doesn't mean there can't be an alternative or an alternative refuah, and that alternative refuah is the Arichas HaGolus and the Yisun of Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, according to this, the scenario will be different. And the following is the scenario which will hopefully take place. What will be the process? Fundamentally, the process will be like this. There will arise a man in Klal Yisrael called Mashiach ben Yosef. He will bring down the Yechida. The Yechida will come down on him, and he will be the completeness of the Mashiach itself. He will take all the Klal Yisrael and bring them back there to Israel. Then there will arise Goyim, the Umas Olam, called Gog and Magog, with Amalus. And they will come up in a war against the Mashiach ben Yosef. However, now that he has all the Oros to himself, you see, he will simply go ahead and kill Amalus and Gog and Magog himself. But fundamentally what we see is that the Mashiach ben Yosef will not die, he will therefore be victorious. And he will kill them. And once he kills Gog and Magog and Amalus, the last enemy of the Jew is totally gone. And once it's totally gone, the Yemoisa Mashiach will have been established. And it is the true beginning of the Geula. From that point on, there will arise the Mashiach ben David. And the Mashiach ben David will simply go ahead with the Mashiach ben Yosef and bringing the final Geula itself in its totality. But there is no need to Memachaya Mace Mashiach ben Yosef. And there's no need to war against Gog and Magog anymore. Because fundamentally the Mashiach ben Yosef will be able to do it from its own koyach. Why? Because there's no Oris which are missing from him. He doesn't have to retrieve anything from from Gog and Magog or Amalus. He's got it already. So therefore, he will have the koyach to destroy them. And that will be the beginning of the whole Inyan of the Geula itself.
I'm familiar with the numbers.
What I'd like to discuss tonight is the concept of the Yemois Mashiach itself. Last week we spoke about the fundamental process itself. The process of removing the Chasson, which is the Mashiach ben Yosef the Mashiach ben David process, and the process of removing the Kilkul, which is the Mashiach ben Yosef process. And we said that these two processes are the two fundamental processes which exist in all of history, and there is nothing else in the Bria. All of history, all the events of mankind, the very design of the Bria in some way relates to these two processes. We will go into this matter much deeper later on, and we'll find that the very Tzuvas HaTorah itself depends on these two processes. However, this is for another time. What I'd like to discuss now fundamentally is the notion of the Yemois Mashiach itself. The Yemois Mashiach is the time when there will be the Malchus of the Bnei Shalom will be totally recognizable, fundamentally. In other words, the basic aspect of the Moshe Mashiach is an aspect of what's called Gili Yechudai. That's its fundamental characteristic. The Moshe Mashiach will be a certain time when everybody in the world who lives at that time will recognize clearly and without any doubts the absolute sovereignty of the Bnei Shalom. As it said in the Pasuk, Hashem lemelech hakol haaretz, bayom ahu yeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad, without any questions. Or umoletz deis Hashem k'mayim liyom chasim. And the entire earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Bnei Shalom like the waters cover the sea. So the fundamental characteristic of the Moshe Mashiach is the fact that there will be a clear perception of the Metzias of the Bnei Shalom in that way, or clear conception of that, with 100% emunah. The fundamental question that we can ask, and we have asked before, is what is the purpose of this period of Gili Yechudai, really? Because the Moshe Mashiach basically takes place at the end of Olam Hazeh. The Moshe Mashiach is not synonymous with Olam Haba. It takes place before. Olam Hazeh, as we know, is supposed to last for 6,000 years. Shis Alpei Shnin. When the Bnei Shalom told Adam Rishon not to do the Chet, he said, if you don't do the Chet, you see, and if you keep the mitzvah that I gave you, you will create Olam Haba. But since he did the Chet, the Bnei Shalom then said, I now will allot 6,000 years from the time of the beginning of the world to the end to see if mankind can't get in a certain state of Olam Haba. At the end of 6,000, Olam Haba starts. Now, the Yemot Mashiach itself occurs before the year 6,000, a certain number of years. We don't know how many years because we don't know clearly when it's going to start. The Yemot Mashiach must come. There must be a period in Olam Hazeh called Yemot Mashiach. This is guaranteed by the Nevi'im, and it's one of the Ikrei Hados, one of the Ikrei of the Emunah itself. How the Yemot Mashiach will transpire can occur in different ways. There are fundamentally two different ways. There's something called Be'ita and something called Be'achishena. Be'ita is where the Yemot Mashiach will transpire through the gates, through a certain specific time, whether or not Klal Yisrael is Zoicha from their own Schusim. And the Yemot Mashiach can also come to another mode called Achishena, where they're Zoicha by their own Schusim and their own Maisim. We'll discuss these two modes a little later on. But in any case, the Yemot Mashiach must happen. What the Bnei Shalom said is the following, that there must come a time in Olam Hazeh itself when I will be Megala my name in the entire Bria, and everyone will recognize clearly that Ani Hashem. The fundamental question that we ask is, why is that necessary? If the function of Olam Hazeh is to provide a makom or a circumstance of Bechira, right, where man can choose, he needs a certain amount of Hester. He needs a certain circumstance where he does not recognize the existence of the Bnei Shalom. That's one of the qualities, therefore, of Olam Hazeh. So the question that's asked is, what then is the purpose of Yemot Mashiach? Why is it that in Olam Hazeh itself, toward the end, there suddenly becomes a period of time when there's total Gili Yechudai, and therefore man cannot really have any Bechira? You see, a period of Gili Yechudai should only be reserved for Olam Haba, because that's where it belongs. Because it's the Gili Yechudai in Olam Haba which fundamentally is man's reward, or his schar. That is the schar itself. Hasogit Yechudai is the schar in Olam Haba. You see. So therefore, why is it given to us in Olam Hazeh in something called the Yemot Mashiach? This is the question that we have to ask on the Yemot Mashiach. What is its function and what is it basically doing here? Why do the Nevi'im also guarantee it, which they obviously do? And why is it so important? The answer to this question lies again in the whole Indian of Adam Rishon. We said it many times, and it's a very fundamental concept, that it was the purpose of Adam Rishon to bring down Eris through the mitzvah. By doing that, he would be able to enhance his own neshama in terms of its power, and his neshama would then mizachir his guf and the entire bria with it, and create an Indian of Olam Haba. In other words, what his job was fundamentally was to undo or remove the chesaron in the bria, the inadequacy in the bria, the fact that the bria lacked certain elements, that it lacked a certain stage called Olam Haba, and he was to take the bria from a state of chesaron to a state of shlemus, or perfection, which was Olam Haba itself. That's what he was supposed to do. he failed to do that, and instead he brought in a kilkul, or a contamination, a tumor, into the Bria. So not only does the Bria lack perfection, but now has an additional negative state of contamination, you see. So it's now two steps from Olam Haba. When the Rebbe said that I will preserve the world, you see, and I will make sure that the world ultimately reaches Olam Haba, what the Rebbe is saying is fundamentally is this, is that I must create a new process, which even if man sins is such that that it will rectify the Bria and bring the Bria back to a state of Chassan. In other words, what the Rebbe said is the following. I want to see Olam Haba. Since I am a Tova Meitiv, I have created the entire world for Olam Haba. You see. But it is possible through man's sins, through his Chatoim, to totally remove that possibility. So what the Rebbe says is that I must guarantee that possibility. That means what the Rebbe did was to create two different processes. One was the process of creating Olam Haba, which is the process of Adam Rishon before the Chet, to remove the Chasson of the Bria. And the other process is to allow man in some way to undo any damage or contamination that he brings into the Bria because of its Chatoim. That's the second process. And that's the two tikkunim. You see, the first tikkun, which is the process of bringing the world from a state of Chasson to a state of Shlemus, that's the process called Mashiach ben David, and that was in the hands of Adam Rishon. But what the Rebbe did was give another process into the world, that should Adam fail to do that and contaminate the Bria, I will give him another process where he will be able to remove the contamination or the kilkul, you see, as well. So these are the two tachlisim, or the two basic purposes. The state of removing the kilkul is a state of refuah, or removing the Bria from its choili, from its sickness. You see. If Adam Rishon had done the mitzvah and not done any chet at all, we say that he would have brought a certain shlemus to the world. That shlemus would have meant that the world is Olam Haba. Now, what would have happened to the Satan in that situation? What would have happened is that the Satan would have disappeared, or the Nachash, which represented the Satan, would have been removed. So the tachlis of Adam Rishon before the Chet, by raising the world from a level of Olam Haba to Olam Haba, means that he would have removed the Satan himself, or the Yetzer Hara himself. Because in Olam Haba there is no Yetzer Hara. When Adam Rishon did the Chet, what he did was, he expanded the Yetzer Hara, or the Satan, into the Bria. And that was the union of the Kilkul. That's called, as we said before, the Zoyama of the Nachash. You see, he created a new concept called Zoyama, which ended the Bria because of his Chet. The second process is directed towards removing the Zoyama of the Nachash. And that's the process of the Mashiach ben Yosef, which is the Kilkul. This then clearly are the two processes and basically what their objectives are. How do these two processes apply to the events of mankind itself? There's a period called Adam Rishon Kodem Achet. In that period itself, there is no Zoyama, there's no Kilkul. All there is Chassan. In that period, Adam therefore only has to do one process. You see, in the period of Adam Rishon Achet, there is a new addition of Kilkul or Zoyama. So not only does it still exist the Chassan and this Nachash, but now there exists an additional aspect of the Zoyama of the Nachash and a Kilkul in the Bria, which means that a new process must enter. Now, if that new process is successful and it removes the Kilkul of the Bria or the Zoyama, what happens? Does that bring the world up to a madrega of Olam Haba? No. All it does is bring the world back to the madrega of Adam Rishon Kodem Achet. You see, in other words, if Adam fails to do the job, Kodem Achet, and therefore we find ourselves in a new period of Achet with a Kilkul in the Bria, we now must be concerned ourselves with removing the Kilkul. But once we remove the Kilkul, that doesn't bring us to Olam Haba. Rather, all that does is simply now bring the world back to what Adam had before the Chet. Because fundamentally, once Kilkul is brought into the Bria, there are two steps to Olam Haba. Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet only had one step to Olam Haba. After the Chet, there were two steps necessary. So, the successful completion of the second step simply brings us back to the first step. Now, what was the matter of Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet? The matter of Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet was a matter of tremendous Gilu Yechudai. Not total Gilu Yechudai, but great, tremendous Gilu Yechudai. Why? Because there was no Kilkul in the Bria. You see, there was no Kilkul, there was no Zoyama. Which means that the Bria at that time of Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet only had a minimum amount of Hester. A slight amount of Hester. It didn't have a great amount of Hester because there was no Kilkul or Zoyama yet. That came in after the Chet. When the Nevi'im prophesied and they said that the world will someday experience a Yemos Mashiach, what were they really saying? What they were saying is the following: that there will yet come back a point in time in the world when the world will again have a period of Gili Yechudai similar to the period of Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet. That's what the Yemos Mashiach is. The Yemos Mashiach really constitutes the period of Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet. And that's its real function. The Yemos Mashiach is not Olam Haba. Its function is not to give a matzav of Gili Yechudo, which is equivalent to Olam Haba. That's not its function. That's the function of Olam Haba. But the matzav of Yemos Mashiach itself simply means that the world, before the end of the world, before Olam Haba, the world will again go back to a state which was similar to the matzav of Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet. Why? Why must it go back? Very simply, it has to go back because if the Banishim says that I guarantee that Olam Haba must exist, then it means the world must go back to the Chet of, to the state of the world before the Chet of Adam Rishon. You see, in order to go to number 3, you must pass through 1, 2, 3. Now, if I guarantee you that the world must come back to the massive of 1, you must go back to 2 and to 1. In other words, we see the following: that if the Banishim guarantees Olam Haba, it means that he guarantees that the world is going to go from a state of Chassan to a state of Shlemus. But that means that in order to get to that Madrega, the world first had to remove all its kilkul. And after having moved its kilkul through the plots of Mashiach ben Yosef, it then is now ready to begin the new plots of Mashiach ben David and raise the level of Chassan to, to Shlemus. But that basically is the process of Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet. And that level of the world is a level of tremendous Gili Yechudai. In other words, a world which exists only for the purpose of going from Chassan to Shlemus has a 99% Gili Yechudai process and 1% Hesti Yechudai. But if you do a Chet, when Adam did a Chet, what he did was he brought in much larger percentages of Hesti Yechudai and much fewer percentages of Gili Yechudai. You see. But the world must come back to a time when it again has the same proportion of Gili Yechudai and Hesti Yechudai that Adam had before the Chet. Because that's the matzav of the Bria only in the state of Chassan. And the Bria must go through that matzav before it can go to Olam Haba. So therefore we see what the Yemos Mashiach is. The Yemos Mashiach is not Olam Haba, and the Yemos Mashiach is not some kind of a special time. The Yemos Mashiach is part and parcel of the Bria itself. It's a repetition of the matzav of Adam Rishon before the Chet. And that's why the Nevi'im are looking forward to it, and that's why they promised to us. Because when the Nevi'im said to us that there will come a time when Klal Yisrael will be in the state of Yemos Mashiach, what the Nevi'im was saying to us is, you see, that the Banishim is going to guarantee us that someday we will have Olam Haba. That's what Yemos Mashiach represents. It represents a guarantee that we will have Olam Haba. Why? Because it represents a guarantee that the world will someday come to a circumstance which was like Adam Rishon Kodim HaChet. And that represents a guarantee that the Banishim is going to completely and successfully remove the entire Kilkul or Zoyamah from the Bria in order to get to that stage. You see? That's what Yemos Mashiach really means. It's the guarantee. If Chas v'Shalom there would not be a Yemos Mashiach, right? Then it means that the world could keep on collecting Zoyamah and Kilkul and never get out of it. The Yemos Mashiach is the guarantee that the world will someday get out of its Zoyamah and its Kilkul, that there will be a refuah Shalema for the Bria, that the Inyan of Mashiach ben Yosef will have been successfully completed, and that the world will then be in a new position to again do what Adam failed to do, and finish the job by bringing the entire world to a state of Olam Haba. That's the Inyan of Yemais Mashiach. That's why if a Jew does not believe in Yemais Mashiach, fundamentally he does not believe in the Haftach of the Bnei Shalom that there will be an Olam Haba. It's identical to that particular Emunah. The Emunah in the Yemais Mashiach is the Emunah, you see, that the Bnei Shalom are Teviyah Meitiv, and that the world will reach its tikkun, and that the Bnei Shalom has the koyach to bring the world to its tikkun. That's what the Emunah in the Yemais Mashiach is. Nevertheless, there is something that's in addition important to know. The truth of the matter is, conceptually speaking, the process would go like this. First there's a process called tikkun of the Chasson. If that fails, then there's a process called tikkun of the Kilkel, right? Now, if tikkun of the Kilkel is successful, then you go back to the process of tikkun of Chasson, and then you finish off the job. That's the way it normally would have followed. However, the truth of the matter is that the world did not follow that process exactly. Because even though Adam, after the Chet, introduced the Kilkel, and the major process is now concerned with the refuah for the Bria, the process of removing the Chasson is also going on. You see, the two processes of Mashiach ben David and Mashiach ben Yosef do not go on consecutively. You see, whereas first there's the Matzav Adam Mishkadim Achet, which is Mashiach ben David, the tikkun of Chasson, and then there's the tikkun of the Kilkel, or the Mashiach ben Yosef, and then you go back to the tikkun of the Chasson. That's the way that logically you would think it flows, but that's not really what happened. Once Adam failed to do the tikkun of the Chasson, and therefore he had to become involved now, mankind had to become involved now in the tikkun of the Kilkel, it doesn't mean that the tikkun of the Chasson was not taking place, because in truth, both of them were taking place. You see, after the Chet of Adam Rishon, it means that the world was now preoccupied with two events. In Adam Rishon, two processes. In Adam Rishon, before the Chet, the world was only involved in one process, which is the tikkun of Chasson. After the Chet, the world is involved now with two processes, which is the tikkun of the Chasson and the tikkun of the Kilkel, both of these processes. In the Yemais Mashiach, which is at the end, the world will go back to the Matzav Adam Rishon, where it will only be concerned with the tikkun of Chasson. However, since the world, up to the point of the Yemais Mashiach, has also been involved with the tikkun of the Chasson, you see, in addition to the tikkun of the Kilkel, it means that by the time that the world gets to the Yemais Mashiach, they will already have done a tremendous amount in terms of the tikkun of the Chasson. Not only will they have successfully removed the tikkun of the Kilkel in order to get there, you see, but they will also have done a tremendous amount of the tikkun of the Chasson. That means that the period of the Yemais Mashiach is really greater than the period of Adam Rishon Kodim Achet. It's greater, because the matzav of Adam Rishon Kodim Achet was purely a matzav of Chasson, where he had to do the entire tikkun of the Chasson. Nothing was done yet. But by the time Klal Yisrael again reaches that matzav in the Yemais Mashiach, it will have done a great deal of that tachlis of tikkun of Chasson along with the tikkun of the Kilkel. It doesn't give up one job and go to a new job and then go back to the old job. Rather, what happens is, it takes on a new job to the first, and the two jobs are going on the entire time, until the Yemais Mashiach, when the original job will go back in its last phase. But, since it was also doing the old job as well as the new, you see, in the matzav of Adam Rishon Achet, up to the time of Yemais Mashiach, it means that the Zman of the Yemais Mashiach will be almost up to the point of Olam Haba. The world will be closer to Olam Haba in the Yemais Mashiach than it was by Adam Rishon Kodim Achet. Because of that point. That answers another question which has been asked, and it's a very critical question, Tom. If Adam Rishon was able to fail, you see, and brought a Kilkel and a Bria, why won't we be able to do the same thing in the Yemais Mashiach? You see, if the Yemais Mashiach is really the period of Adam Rishon before the Chet, maybe they'll fail at that time. So then they bring a new Kilkel and a Bria, and they got to start the entire process over again. You see, and the answer that I want to give, although it's not a clear-cut answer, is the fact that the Yemais Mashiach is really not totally the matzav of Adam Rishon before the Chet, because it already brought the world almost completely to a level of Olam Haba. You see, so basically, by the time the world reaches the Yemais Mashiach, you see, and goes through that period, it will be very, very close to Olam Haba already. So there's very little left even to fail in that sense. So in a certain sense, you cannot really ever bring again that kind of kilkel which Adam brought before the Chet. You see, because he was much further away from Olam Haba than we will be in the Yemais Mashiach. Thus we see that there are three phases or stages in history. There's a stage called Adam Rishon Kodesh Machet, where his main function and only function was to Masakin the Chassan. He absolutely failed in that function. So therefore we entered the second phase of history called Adam Rishon Achachet, where a new process came to the Bria called the Tikkun of the Kilkel. Now even though that process came into the Bria, the old process of the Tikkun of the Chassan was also going on. And then we have the third phase called the Yemais Mashiach, which fundamentally is similar to the period of Adam Rishon Kodesh Machet, in the sense that it only has the process of Tikkun of Chassan. That's all. The Tikkun of Kilkel was already finished by the Mashiach ben Yosef right before the start of the Yemais Mashiach. You see, but that Yemais Mashiach is only similar to Adam Rishon Kodesh Machet, but not identical to it, because the Yemais Mashiach has that process of the Tikkun of Chassan to a large extent already fulfilled in the stage prior to it, which is Adam Rishon Achachet, since it was also going on with the Tikkun of the Kilkel.
Why did...
According to basically what we've said, where there are three stages. In the first stage, there's only one process, which is the Tikkun of Chassan, and in the third stage, Yemais Mashiach, there's also one process, which is Tikkun of Chassan, but it's mostly completed already. And in the second stage, there are two processes, Mashiach ben Yosef, or Tikkun of Kilkel, and Mashiach ben David, or the Tikkun of the Chassan going on. According to this understanding, we can see something very important. That what the Yemais Mashiach looks like, or the particular characteristics of what type of Gili Yehuda will be manifest then, and what the Mashiachim themselves look like, has a great deal to do with when the Yemais Mashiach is going to appear. What do I mean? If the Yemais Mashiach appears earlier in history, let's say by the time of Noach, and the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and the time of Yerov, what happens is that the Yemais Mashiach, the characteristics of the Yemais Mashiach really are different in each of these three periods of time. Why? In the time of Noach, which was not that far after Adam Rishon, for example, if the Yemais Mashiach would appear then, in other words, if the Zoyama would have been completely removed by that time, you see, then what would have happened is that the Uris that would have brought down would have been fewer Uris than what exists now in the time of Adam Rishon Achachet. You see, that means that the Yemais Mashiach, in a certain sense, that would have appeared would not have been as complete as the Yemais Mashiach which appears later on. If the Yemais Mashiach would appear in the time of, let's say, Yetzias Mitzrayim, you see, it means the world had to clean up more Zoyama. But while the world is cleaning up more Zoyama, they're also acquiring more and more Uris. You see, it means they're being mashlim more Chassan. So when the Yemais Mashiach do appear finally in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, that Yemais Mashiach, in a certain sense, is in a certain sense higher than the Yemais Mashiach that would have appeared before. You see, because it's already involved more and more with Tikkun Chassan. And finally, if the Yemais Mashiach comes by Yerobim, it would have been even higher than that. And finally, if the Yemais Mashiach comes at the end of the capes, it is the closest to Olam Haba. Why? Because even though the period before took care of all the Zoyama, but at the same time, Klal Yisrael was also working to bring down more and more Uris. You see, so therefore, whatever is left in the Yemais Mashiach is much less to do in order to finish off the job. So the basic rule that we see is this, which is an astonishing concept. The longer it takes for the Yemais Mashiach to appear, or the longer it takes for the world to remove its kilkel and to go back to the matter of Adam Rishon Kodesh Machet, you see, the less of a job does that Yemais Mashiach have to do in terms of reaching the Tikkun of the Chassan, because it will have done that job before. So therefore, it's on a higher level, closer to Olam Haba. It's an amazing concept. You see, the longer it takes for Yemais Mashiach to get there, then the more complete it is by the time it finally arrives. The more complete, the more perfected it is by the time it arrives. Because the job that was supposed to have been done by Adam Rishon Kodesh Machet is continuously being done even before the Yemais Mashiach arrives. This concept is a very correct one. Fundamentally, by Adam Rishon Kodesh Machet, there were Uris that were coming down. Now, he failed to use any of those Uris. Instead, he drove those Uris into the hands of the Satan. Well, after that, they had to clean up the Sultan's Act, or the Zoyamah, and get back those Urus. But while they were doing that, new Urus were constantly coming down, constantly, which means that they started doing that which Adam failed to do. They started building more and more Urus. So the process of Olam Haba really started in earnest. Adam didn't do anything for Olam Haba. That's an amazing thing. All Adam did, by Adam only had one mitzvah. With that one mitzvah, if he would have done, he would have brought out the entire bag of Urus, and suddenly there would have been the entire Olam Haba. You see. But since he failed, and all he did was bring in a kilkul, he didn't do anything to bring the world closer to Olam Haba. All he did fundamentally was to drive the world away from Olam Haba by bringing a kilkul. So after the Chet, what happened is the world had become occupied with getting rid of all this kilkul, and beginning in earnest to bring the world towards Olam Haba. And that's what the world did. The world after the Chet was concerned with removing the kilkul and bringing the world towards Olam Haba, you see. So therefore, Yemot Mashiach, which is the climax of that period, the Yemot Mashiach is really the climax of this thing. The Yemot Mashiach represents the period when the job of removing the kilkul is finished, and what you want to do is bring down the last of the Urus which are necessary to create Olam Haba. So in this case, the longer the Yemot Mashiach is away, the further on in history that it takes for mankind to reach the Yemot Mashiach, the more complete it will be when it finally gets here. Because a great deal of its process will have been done prior to its period. In the time when Klal Yisrael was also removing the kilkul, they would also been bringing down Urus. So this is an amazing concept, that such a thing exists. That's why I say very clearly that the Yemot Mashiach differs in its characteristics in terms of its degree of Gili Yechudai or Shleimus, you see, as it happens in different periods. The later that it happens, the more Shalom it becomes, meaning that the less it has to do in that period to reach Olam Haba. The more it closely resembles what Olam Haba needs. Fundamentally then, there's the concept is correct. In the state of the world, Achachet, the world is now preoccupied in removing the kilkul, but at the same time it's also occupied in bringing down the Urus. But the question is, they can bring down more kilkulim and more kilkulim and so on. This is very true. So therefore, that's why the Achachet is taking so long. The Achachet, the reason why the world is taking so long to get to the Yemot Mashiach is not because it's got to handle the original kilkul that Adam brought in, but it's got to handle the kilkul that people keep on bringing into the Bria because of their own chatoim. You see, that's what keeps on pushing off the Yemot Mashiach. What pushes off the Yemot Mashiach from generation to generation is the fact that each generation brings in a new kilkul, and therefore it has to begin to deal with that kilkul anew, just like it has to do with the kilkul of Adam Rishon. You see, but it doesn't matter. You see, the fact that the world brings in more and more kilkulim means simply the fact that the world is further pushing away the Yemot Mashiach. You see, but at the same time, the world is still bringing down more and more Urus. That is also happening. So therefore, when the Yemot Mashiach do happen, it's going to happen in a more perfected way than if it would happen before. One does not necessarily negate the other. You see, the addition of kilkul simply pushes away the Yemot Mashiach. You see, but also as the Yemot Mashiach is pushed away, it also gives a time opportunity for people, to bring down more Urus, which means that when the Yemot Mashiach does appear, it has less of a job to do, it's more perfected, and therefore it's more closer to the Inyan of Olam Haba. It's an inverse proportion. The more tikkun of Chasson that takes place before the Yemot Mashiach, the less tikkun of the Chasson that has to take place after the Yemot Mashiach. Hence, the longer it takes for the Yemot Mashiach to appear, the more perfected it is. In the sense that it already has a much higher degree of shleimus than if it would have occurred before. Yes, the longer it takes to masakin the kilkul before the Yemot Mashiach, the less it takes to masakin the Chasson in the Yemot Mashiach. You find this most radical concept of the Yemot Mashiach by Adam Rishon Kodim Chet. Adam Rishon before the Chet, where was the Yemot Mashiach? When was the Yemot Mashiach? So the answer is, there was no... Yemot Mashiach was really the motive of Adam Rishon Kodim Chet. You see. In a sense. See, Adam Rishon Kodim Chet was somewhat of a different situation. He would have been the Mashiach, but he would have been the Mashiach only after he brought in the tikkun of the Bria. You see. There was no purpose of an Adam Rishon by Kodim Chet for Yemot Mashiach, because you didn't have to repeat the Inyan of Adam Rishon Kodim Chet. He was in that period. You know, the period of Adam Rishon Kodim Chet is synonymous with what we call the Yemot Mashiach today. Except that by Adam Rishon Kodim Achet, you see, the Mashiach appears after the Yemos Mashiach, so to speak. Because the Mashiach appears after the Tikkun of the Chesron is completed.
What?
Whereas once Adam introduced the Chet, then the Mashiach appears before the Tikkun of the Chesron is completed. Therefore, the concept of Mashiach is not exactly the same anymore as it would have been by Adam Rishon before the Chet. By Adam Rishon Kodim Achet, the concept of Mashiach was the completion of the job. He would have been Mashiach if it would have been Olam Haba. The Chida would have descended on him in the sense that would have become Olam Haba in that way. So therefore, the Mashiach appears after the Tikkun of the Chesron takes place. But once he did the Chet, what it is the world now has to be preoccupied with removing the kilkul and slowly begin to acquire new earth, which is the Tikkun of the Chesron. And then it has to go back to a period called the Mashiach, which is a repetition of Adam Rishon Kodim Achet. But in that period, you already have the Mashiach, which means that the Mashiach, as he appears, the Two Mashichim, who appear, you see, who usher in the Mashiach, really usher in the stage which has to finish off the job of Adam Rishon Kodim Achet. You see, which means that the concept of Mashiach, of Adam Rishon Achet, is really simply individuals who don't finish the entire job and bring in the Inyan of Olam Haba, but rather they only finish in a certain sense certain processes that relate to Olam Haba in that way. Whereas that by Adam became the Mashiach only after the entire process was completed. He doesn't assist the processes in taking place. He becomes Mashiach after in that sense. What do you see from all this? You fundamentally see this, is that the concept of the Mashiach, the concept of the Two Mashichim, the concept of the Yemos Mashiach is a variable concept. Its particular facets change depending on when it occurs. It depends on what the status of Klal Yisrael is in history in terms of the Tikkun of the Chesron and the Tikkun of Kilkul that it has achieved up to that point in time. You see, that will determine what the Yemos Mashiach will look like. It will determine what the Mashiachim themselves will look like, basically. How did the world reach the level of Yemos Mashiach? How did the world finally get to the level of a Gili Yehuda which is similar or even greater than the time of Adam Rishon before the Chet? Well, fundamentally, Chazal says there are two ways really. It says in the pasuk, Ani Hashem be'ita achishena. So Chazal learn out that there are two ways that we can arrive at Yemos Mashiach, which is, in other words, there are two ways in which we can remove the Tikkun of the Kilkul. How? One is, or a Tikkun of the Kilkul and remove the Tikkun of the Chesron. And one is called achishena. That's if Klal Yisrael does mitzvahs and does tshuva, so what happens is, by doing tshuva, by doing mitzvahs, it removes the kilkul rapidly, and it brings in the world to a madreg of Olam Haba, and Yemos Mashiach. That's called achishena. I will hurry it, or I will hasten it. In other words, if Klal Yisrael is zoicha, if the world is full of tzaddikim, when Chazal say that Yemos Mashiach will come ein ben davar ba in the world either kula zakoyim or kula chayavim. The Mashiach will come when the world is either full of Rishonim or full of Tzaddikim. So, fundamentally, there are two ways to bring the Mashiach. One way, if the world is full of Tzaddikim, where Klal Yisrael do tshuva, and they show Torah mitzvahs, kohegen, the way it should be, what happens? Then what happens is that they bring down the last of the Uris down from the Shemayim, and they bring in the last period, they masakin the Zoyama, and they bring in the last period of Yemos Mashiach. When can that happen? That can happen at any point in time. Any point in time. Because we believe that what? At any point in time, Klal Yisrael can do that. And Achishena could be applicable at any point in time. The other way is if Klal Yisrael is not Zoicha, and the Chas v'Shalom Rishoyim, or the Choytim in that sense. In that case, that the Mashiach has to come, because the Boshim said that the Yemos Mashiach must start by a certain time. It must start by a certain time called the Kates. And after that, the Mashiach must start. The Mashiach must come in a certain year. No one knows that year. The only two people who ever knew that year was Yaakov Avinu and Daniel, and I think also Yosef HaTzadik. No one else ever knew the year when he must come, in that sense. But that year represents the time that it must be. What is the difference between Achishena and Be'ita? What is the difference if the most Mashiach or the Mashiach comes if Klal Yisrael is Zoicha or if Klal Yisrael is not Zoicha? There is a very big difference. First of all, it doesn't make sense. How could the Mashiach come Be'ita or Be'kate? How could the Mashiach come in a certain time? If the whole Inyan of the Mashiach is the Inyan of removing the Zoyama and being Masak in the Chson, basically, that has to do with Maisim, that has to do with mitzvahs, that has to do with deeds of men. You see. So what does the Inyan of a case or Inyan of a time have to do with anything? How could Klal Yisrael be Zoycha to a Mashiach just by the fact that he's got to come by a certain date? What does a date have to do with anything? The way the Mashiach is coming is by deeds, by Maisim, not by time, by Zman, by dates. So there seems to be two different concepts here, you see. The concept of a date means that the Mashiach will come at a certain time, no matter what the Maisim are. And the concept of Achishena is that the Mashiach can only come by deeds. It has nothing to do with time, because it can come at any time. These are antagonistic concepts, you see. They're mutually exclusive concepts. If the Mashiach comes through deeds, you see, that has nothing to do with time. When you're zoicha to your ma'aseh, that's when he comes. But if it comes through time, by a case, then it has nothing to do with deeds. You see. So the question is, how do you reconcile these two different opposing views of what it is? The obvious answer is that the Achishena is the more fundamental. The Mashiach comes by deeds, by tshuva and by deeds. So therefore, since he comes by deeds, he can come at any time. However, should Klal Yisrael fail to do the deeds which are necessary, he will come by the time. What do you mean by the time? It means that he will come to other deeds, to involuntary deeds. You see, that's the difference. Achishena means that he will come to voluntary deeds, to mitzvahs and to tshuva. Be'ita means that he will come to involuntary deeds, to Yisuin and Soros Rabois. That's what it means. The tremendous Soros and Yisuin that you see in the Bria, you see, are the involuntary deeds that mankind must go through to bring the Mashiach. However, the Baruch Hashem has an Oiskes Cheshbon in a certain way. That the Baruch Hashem has it figured out. That no matter what Klal Yisrael does, no matter how bad the deeds are, he has to figure out how many involuntary deeds he has to give them to finally finish it up by a certain date. And that date is the case. You see, the case is nothing more. It doesn't mean that the Mashiach comes because of that date. No. That date is nothing more than a gilui, or revelation, that if he doesn't come to voluntary deeds, then we'll come to involuntary deeds, through Yisuan. But that Yisuan is calculated to finally finish by the time the case rolls in. You see what I'm saying? That's fundamentally what the case means. It means that even if Klal Yisrael does not do the Maisim, the Baruch Hashem says, I will bring the Mashiach. I will bring the Mashiach by giving you the Yisuan which is necessary. And the Tzoros. However, I will never have to give you more Yisuan and more Tzoros than is necessary, than the fact that I have to go beyond this date. You see, I will make sure that I will get it all the Yisuan in before this date. So by this date, he must come. And it's an exact calculation. Those are the two modes of Achishena and Be'ita. One is either through voluntary deeds, Achishena, or involuntary deeds, Be'ita, which has an end, which has a final time period on that. The date is a simon of when the Mashiach is coming. It's not the reason, it's not the sibah of why he comes. In other words, the Achishena means that the Mashiach will arrive through the Hanukkah Mishpat, because Klal Yisrael is zoicha to it. Be'ita means that the Mashiach will arrive by the Hanukkah Yichud, you see. Which means even if Klal Yisrael is not zoicha to it, which functions through other types of Yeshuas, besides mitzvahs, which have to do with Yisuin and so on. What we therefore see is a very critical thing in terms of the history of mankind. That we see an important concept. If the Moshe Mashiach can arrive two different ways, through what's called Achishena, which is fundamentally the Hanukkah HaMishpat, and Be'ita, which is the Hanukkah HaYichud, which means that the Hanukkah HaMishpat works mostly through Maisim, through Bechira, and through Tshuva, and the Hanukkah HaYichud works through Yisuin. You see, these are the two ways that the Moshe Mashiach will transpire. However, they are inversely related. What do we mean? When Adam Rishon was first created before the Chet, he had 100% Bechira, which means that if he had done the mitzvah, the mitzvah that he had, he would have brought in Yemais Mashiach, because he would have been the Mashiach himself and ushered in Olam Haba. He therefore had 100% bechira. That means that if Adam had succeeded in bringing the Indian Mashiach, it would have been an Achishena. You see, there was no concept of Be'ita then at all. There's no Hanokas Yichud working at all. When Adam Rishon failed to bring in the Yemais Mashiach, you see, it was left for the next generation and so on. Now, the next generation already doesn't have as much bechira already, because it means that there's already a certain amount of involuntary acts that have to go on. So that oil of after the Adam Rishon had, let's say, 95% bechira and only 5% Yeshua in that sense. That means basically that the Hanagas HaMishpat worked 95% and the Hanagas HaYichud only worked 5%. As time went on, the Hanagas HaMishpat brings the Inyan of Yemais Mashiach to less and less of a degree. As the Hanagas HaMishpat or Achishena begins to recede, the Hanagas HaYichud, which works through the Inyan of Be'ita, begins to expand. Which means that the main vehicle of bringing the Yemais Mashiach is through Tzuras and through Tigbor Sarah or Yisuin. So they're inversely related. At the beginning of the world functioned completely by the Hanagas HaMishpat. But as the world goes further and further, you see, it means that the world, in order to reach its tikkun, has to use more and more the Hanagas HaYichud. Well, the more the Hanagas HaYichud is used, the more involuntary acts are done. Which means the less the Hanagas HaMishpat is used, the less Bechira is Shayach. In that sense, you see. That means that Yemais Mashiach, when it finally does come, comes in a very different way than at the beginning. Now, as Yemais Mashiach is pushed off until it gets very close to the case itself, what does it mean? It means when we're very close to the last period of time, when the Mashiach himself must come already, if we're that close, it means that Hanagas HaYichud is already working 90%, right? And Hanagas HaMishpat is only working 10%. You see? That means most of the way that the Mashiach is going to be coming alive has to do with the Inyan of Yisuin or Tigbor Sarah. And only a very small percentage of the preoccupation of Klal Yisrael is involved with what? Is involved with the Achishena, is involved with the Hanagas HaMishpat, which is Bechira. You see? Now, this affects two very important things. What happens then? What it means is the following. Since most of the tikkun is coming through the Hanagas HaYichud, through Yisuin, and very little is coming to the Hanagas HaMishpat, right? If Yemais Mashiach is put off almost to the case, you see what I'm saying? What does that mean? It means that most of the Jews or Klal Yisrael who are involved in bringing the tikkun to the world, right, at that point in time, which is the Ikvus of the Mashiach, will not be involved in Bechira. Most of them will be involved in Tzuras. Only very few of them will be involved in Bechira. And even those that are involved in Bechira will not be involved in Bechira in terms of 100% Bechira, but they'll only be involved in Bechira in very small capacities. You see? Now, I don't know if you realize it, but I am describing this generation. Because 90% of the Jews in this generation, unfortunately, are not frum at all. What does that mean? That means most of these Jews, what is their tachlis? Their fundamental tachlis is that they're involved either in Yisuin, or else they're involved with a Bechira level which is very small. You see?